The London system is on the board after d4, d5, and then bishop f4. The move now is c5, and after e3, knight c6, and after c3, queen b6 is already targeting this b2 square. Then the queen will have access to the rook, and if the knight moves, the queen can take the pawn. So white has a few responses available now. I'm going to start from b3. After this move, knight f6, and after the normal looking move, bishop d3, black should play this move, g6. Now the reason is that this bishop will go from these dark squares from g7. Usually in the London system you can see e6 and then bishop d6, but that's only possible if the queen is in d8 protecting the bishop. In this case that's not possible. Also, the good thing about this fianchetto move is that the bishop and the rook will not have that much attack on h7 available. Now white continues with development, let's say with knight d2, but even with other moves the plan will still be the same. Now black goes knight h5 attacking the bishop, so now white can just develop the knight to e2. That's a move that is potentially happening because it makes sense. Black's putting a lot of pressure on the d4 square. The knight is threatening to take the bishop and break the pawn structure, not to mention that black also wins a pawn due to the massive attack on d4. So after knight e2 to protect the bishop like that, black goes on with bishop g7, and now whether white just moves the bishop again to try and save it from the knight and trying to preserve the bishop pair, or white castles, well, in both cases the plan is still the same. Black castles as well and then pushes h6, and so now the bishop will have to move again. So the bishop goes back to f4, for example. Could have gone to h4 and then we will have another plan. If it goes to f4, now the move is bishop g4. The idea is to start eliminating the defenders from these squares where we want to end up. Like the knight wants to end up in f4 and break the pawn structure, and so for that we need to remove this e2 knight. Also the pawn and the knight and the queen and the bishop, they're all attacking this square, so we want to start taking this pawn and claim full control over the center. So black is attacking the knight. If white attacks the bishop, then we just go ahead, take, and now pawn takes, and the pawn cannot recapture due to this, and then white's position is just much better. If white takes like this, then we have the same thing, because we can just take the bishop and then win this pawn and also have an amazing position. The same situation if white tries to preserve this knight that protects so many crucial squares by playing f3, the weakness over the square d4 becomes more and more visible. Black can just go on by taking, white takes the bishop, and now black takes the bishop in f4. So there's plenty of ways to take back. So if white takes with the pawn, now pawn takes pawn, that comes with a check, and then white will be up in material. Especially after that move, there will be an attack on the rook, and then a pass pawn and the queen d3 with defending the pawn and attacking the bishop. So it's going to be a completely dominating situation for black. Another scenario is if white takes back with the knight. Well, in that case, this move here is very strong. Pawn's attacking the knight. This is a passed pawn. It will attack the queen next move. The bishop will win the exchange. The queen is still attacking this e3 square that comes with a check. And again, black is just completely winning. One last scenario that has to be seen is what happens after knight takes f4. White takes with the rook. Now e5 happens. The rook's got really nowhere to go except going all the way back. So if it goes up, we've got a bunch of forks. Rook f2, then again we have another fork. So rook f1, and now simply the same plan all the time. Pawn takes pawn, and now we're attacking the knight. Plus we have these two pawns together, and black is going to be easily producing a passed pawn. If knight takes back, then queen here is a fork. and not to mention pawn up, bishop attacking the rook, and the same blunder occurs each time. So now I'm going back. Earlier we went through bishop goes back to f4. So now if bishop goes back to h4 after being attacked by the h6 pawn, black goes on with e5, putting more and more pressure on the d4 square. Now black is threatening to just take the pawn and win material. So in order not to lose material, white should take the pawn. So either he takes this one or this one. Starting from here, let's say black takes c5, then queen takes back, and now white can try some sort of counter attack, also because the white pieces aren't able to move anywhere. So knight g3, and then the bishop here is going to get trapped after the knight moves again, and then g5, and if the bishop takes the knight and bishop takes back, black is losing the bishop pair with no compensation for that. And knights, none of the knights are able to move anywhere in the central squares due to good control of the center by the pawns. So after b4, queen b6, and a4, now black goes on with the plan. That was the plan that black was meant to do before the pawn started attacking the queen. So bishop g3, that's not really good because knight can take this, and well, if this pawn takes the knight, then white king is getting less safe. So that's not ideal. If he takes with this pawn, with the f pawn, and queen here comes with check and the easy win. And if knight takes knight, then the pawn goes out to e4, and then the bishop will take the pawn in c3, and possibly this pawn after the attack on the rook. So that's also easily winning. So white will try to do another thing, basically move the knight away, and then the queen will be attacking this knight. So giving up the bishop, but at least doubling up the h pawn of the black player and taking this knight. So before doing that, white can try to attack this queen again to remove the queen from this threatening diagonal. So queen c7, and now knight c1, the queen is going for the knight. And so in this case, black just continues by taking the bishop. Queen takes back, and now black is up the bishop pair basically. But now black's attack is happening. Pawn up attacking the bishop, and finally we can go for the square. The bishop's got nowhere to go except probably b5, but even then, in any case, we'll still be taking this pawn. Bishop takes e3 with an attack on the rook and on the knight. The rook will have to move to the only square where it could be protecting the other piece. But then knight takes b4, attacking the rook is completely winning. So that forces white to take this knight first, and then we take back. And white had to take the knight though, also because of the threat of knight takes b4. So now white can play rook a2, and now queen d6. Now white has a bunch of forced moves. He has to develop his pieces because the position of the black player with the two bishops and so much more space is just too dominating. So after knight e2, the knight is trying to go to some decent looking squares, and the bishop can go on taking the pawn. The queen takes the h4 pawn, and now black goes on with bishop a6, threatening the knight. And also because this is the only diagonal that makes sense for this bishop to go, black's future plan is to push the f5 pawn. After a move like rook e1, black can take the knight, rook takes back, and now after f5, black's position is completely winning due to this c6 passed pawn. So black is ready to push c5 soon. So going back to the previous situation, if pawn does not take in c5 but actually takes in e5, the knight takes back with an attack on the bishop, threatening to win the bishop pair from the opponent. White bishop goes to the only square where it doesn't get harassed, which is bishop c2, and now rook e8, still having the same plan of pushing g5. Rook e1, and now g5 is coming anyway. After bishop g3, we proceed to the obvious knight g3, which happens the vast majority of times. The bishop goes to g3. Knight takes back in order not to break the pawn structure, and now d4 is coming. So the e5 pawn move was a crushing move that aimed at undermining white's pawns in the center. So after pawn takes and then pawn takes and then pawn takes again, black develops his last bishop, and well, now this pawn cannot move due to the check, and if knight goes to f3, then simply knight takes f3, pawn takes back, and then rook check, queen takes back, and then black wins a pawn and easily the game. So if queen goes to c1, for example, now the queen will just be taking this pawn, and black's position is much better, especially mentioning the obvious threat as seen before, that this queen and the bishop are on the same diagonal, so with threatening to win the exchange. So white will not even be able to develop this knight here or here for that reason. The plan is similar even in case the initial variation changes like really slightly. So for example, after queen b6 attacking the b2 pawn and b3, now the move is knight f6, bishop d3, and g6. Now earlier I went through knight bd2, now I can go through knight f3, but I'm just showing how the plan remains pretty much the same. Not hard to guess, now the move is knight h5, and after bishop g5, now black plays bishop g7, and after castling, the plan is still h6, and bishop h4, and then g5. So it looks very similar to what was seen before. The reason why this h6 and g5 came very quickly is also because the queen was not being attacked, and also because the bishop had gone to g5 instead of going to g3 when we're attacking it earlier with knight h5. If the bishop goes to g3, then we will take it, and that will help to break the pawn structure in front of the opponent king. It will either make his own h5 weaker, or he will take the f pawn, removing a defender of the e pawn, which means that the defense on d4 square will be even weaker. So and we will eventually target that pawn. And so because white does not want to move this bishop, the best option for white is to take this pawn with an attack on the queen. Queen takes back, and now knight d4 puts the knight in a better square, allows the queen to attack the knight. And so if we were to take this bishop, white will think about the compensation of having the opponent doubling up the h-pawn and also infiltrating the queen closer to the king's area. But after that move, black will have to play this move, knight f4. Now the reason is pretty deep, in a way that what happens is that black will still have to take this. After white takes knight, black will still have to take this bishop. So we still are doubling up our and also isolating our h-pawn, and the queen is not really unallowed to come in here, except she's not doing it right now, and we've managed to double up the opponent f-pawn, and now we have more control, way more control over the square d4. So now black is threatening to obviously win this square and put the bishop in an amazing situation where it's going to target the rook. So after knight b5, black simply castles. So the structure of the game looks pretty similar, pretty much in most variations. After knight c7 and rook b8, knight takes pawn. Of course, obviously the knight cannot be taken because of the bishop check, and then the queen takes the queen for free, or at least for two minor pieces, which is not good. So black just goes on with rook, and after bishop c4 and moves like e6 will win. or even well, same thing, if white had protected with the pawn, then you can see the power of this bishop. So this is pretty pointless now. So going back to the previous situation, here straight after knight f3, after knight h5 attacking the bishop, earlier I went through bishop g5 and mentioned that if bishop g3 the knight takes, at least after white castles. That's important to mention. White can also try pawn takes and then queen takes and then knight d4, and now goes on with the already established type of move in this situation, knight takes here, reducing the pressure over this, reducing the defense over this d4 square. Well, take and then take. Black just has to be careful to not take this back because of the bishop check, so always be careful to these kind of rookie maneuvers. So now black goes on with development. It's important not to leave it out. Bishop h6, it's important. It's kind of provoking move as well because, some not very skilled player might play g3 here, which just makes the king side area even weaker, considering that he's not going to be able to castle long side, and now is making his king side also ugly. It's also targeting a pawn. So after knight takes and queen takes back, and now white is lost the bishop for knight, and he's got a double pawn, so he's not completely lost, but the position is better for black after moves like queen e2, queen d6, in order to allow black to castle, because the e7 pawn was hanging. White's best chances are with the check, and after king f8, the two players just go on with normal moves. White is now forced to play g3 because of the free pawn, and after bishop g7 and castle, players just go on normally, with black having quite better chances due to the possibility to immediately make the black rook that is on the file nearby the opponent king active. So h5, and after moves like rook e1 and h4, black just has an edge. And the domination over the white squares near the opponent king will be more and more crucial now. After queen f3, of course, well, white doesn't want to take the pawn because of how this is going to look like. So after pawn takes and pawn takes, so now black's rook on an open file, and black having two bishops. It was important black didn't trade the bishop earlier when the bishop gave a check in b5. It was important not to trade, of course, because we were going to keep the two bishops, and also the keen attack on d4 and f4 with the knight all allowed this favorable endgame to happen. After queen check, and now the king will have to move and probably still try to defend this pawn in order not to allow the rook in the second rank, and king here. Black can even sacrifice the bishop in g4, which goes on to prove how much better the position of the black player is, and especially considering the development or the lack of development of the white player. The queen will not be able to take the bishop due to queen f2, and so after a move like queen f1, now the attack that the black pieces are creating is reinforced by bishop f6, and then the plan of the king, and even doubling up the rook, even sacrifice the rook, should probably lead somewhere. I'm not even going to calculate that deeply here. One more scenario I'm going to go through is what happens after knight h5 and white decides to take the pawn in c5 with an attack on the queen before moving the bishop to g5. The order of the moves here changes slightly. The plan remains very similar. Black goes on with bishop g7, and now white can try knight d4. The difference this time is that earlier the knight tried, white player tried knight d4 after the bishop had been kicked back, which would allow the queen to attack the knight immediately after playing g5. So, for instance, h6, bishop, h4, and now black can try this maneuver anyway. So earlier the pawn was able to take the bishop straight after the pawn had taken our knight. In this case, that's not possible, but the knowledge of this pattern that eliminates the e pawn from controlling the e file is so important, because what happens now is black can finally make use of all the pressure that he's been building on the d4 square with these pieces. So knight takes, and now the pawn cannot take back because black wins the exchange. So after b4 and queen b6, or white just goes on with normal moves like castling, black just has a safe square here in f5 with an attack on the bishop, and with an idea of breaking the pawn structure near the opponent king. Bishop takes just leads white to get a pawn, but after rook d8 and queen moving somewhere safe, at least for the moment, black's pieces are much better. Another pawn sacrifice that is possible to make black's position even more aggressive is g5, that after pawn takes and then bishop takes, the black player can go on with bishop h6. The position is amazing for black. Another scenario I'm going to go through is after knight h5, the white player might not want to deal with the whole pawn structure problem that arises after knight takes 4, or just he might be knowledgeable enough to know and to avoid this line. So after takes, and then b4, and then queen goes back, white might just try to gain some space on the queen side and move the bishop to a5. It's not very unusual, it can happen. And after knight takes and knight takes, white can go for this queen check that looks super threatening, because he cannot be stopped by a bishop due to checkmate threat, and cannot be stopped by a queen either. Queen here gets taken, and the king will have to move, plus knight f7 is a disaster for black, is completely lost. So that's one of the reasons why the white player can give up the bishop in e5. But even then, bishop g7 will do perfectly fine, queen a4, and then king f8. So this attack that quite a few players of very high level might drop on you will eventually vanish. Now the knight has to move because of the attack of the bishop. So after knight f3 and now e5, black is immediately threatening a fork. So the rushed attack of the white player is now paying the consequences for that. And after bishop e2, black is going for the usual square, d4. See how powerful this bishop is, that doesn't allow white to capture in any way. If white were to take with... So now white king's safety becomes a priority. If this pawn were to take, a move like knight f4 will just stop white from castling due to the threat of taking g2 with check, or taking the bishop, and then black's pawn is going to take this, and white will not really be able to recapture because of the pawn takes and bishop takes, knight takes, queen takes, the rook is trapped. Well, if white takes with this pawn, then really nothing changes, because then there's still too many attackers here that attack on a diagonal, like queen bishop, and the rook is in trouble. So after a move like castling, which is definitely the best, black can take this pawn and, well, threaten to infiltrate the queen. And after a move like queen b5, swapping or asking for a swap, black can play the exact same move that goes on in so many variations that we've seen so far, which is knight f4. And Now, of course, the queen cannot take the queen due to the intermediate move. So after bishop c4 and a swap. Now, black is so much better here. He just needs to play accurately until the end to have an easy win. After rook takes back, now black has a passed pawn and the bishop pair again. Black goes on with a plan like king e7 and the idea of bringing the bishop and the two rooks into the open files, and black should play a very comfortable endgame. With the two bishops, an extra passed pawn, and soon the two rooks to be developed into open files.